This is part two of my applied engineering geology PowerPoint, originally done for a graduate level class at San Diego State University on engineering geology. So last time, or for part one, we covered, generally speaking, the role of the engineering geologist as it pertains to his or her input to construction projects, whether they be buildings, bridges, roads, etc. This time I'm looking at discussing major issues that an engineering geologist gets involved with and that he or she helps architects, developers, builders, geotechnical engineers in designing and constructing safe and stable structures, whatever they may be. So I'm going to talk about shaky ground first. Shaky ground, of course, meaning earthquakes. And let's go from there. So here is a photo I took at a construction site in the San Diego area. What we're looking at is a excavation exposure. And we're looking at a pretty well-defined earthquake fault in the excavation wall. You can see that you can see a fault here, fault plane, which runs near vertical up and down this excavation wall. And it's apparent that the left side, as we're looking at it, has gone down and the right side has gone up. Distance between the top of this distinct marker bed up here and the top of this marker bed here is about 2 feet. So it's fairly major movement as faults go. When we see something like this at a construction site, of course, we have to, as engineering geologists, map it, log it, make sure that everybody knows about it, including the construction crews, the owner, the developer, and the geotechnical engineer. Now, the next thing we have to do is determine whether this is an active fault. In this case, there is no topsoil layer exposed, so it's pretty difficult to determine whether it's active and whether it's displaced young sediments. But in this case, we concluded this is an older bedrock fault through Eocene scripts formation sediments, sedimentary rock. So in this case, it did not delay or affect or impact construction. So let's look at some case studies of major earthquakes and the major risks and vulnerabilities that they present to land use and to where people live and how they live. This is the San Francisco Bay, San Francisco Peninsula. North is up, of course. All these red areas are areas of what we call liquefaction risk. Liquefaction is a phenomenon that occurs during major seismic events where you have shallow, saturated, fine sandy sediments at certain depths, generally within the top 50 feet from ground surface. When a large earthquake comes along, it shakes everything up, and it shakes these loose, saturated sediments up, which cause some of the sediment sometimes can shoot up towards the surface along pre-existing fractures. And many times it just loosens everything up. It increases the volume of the sediment. It releases water between pores. It weakens the material generally, and it can cause compaction after the shaking is stopped so that you get ground settlement at the top after the shaking has dissipated. So water has been released. The pores between previously water-filled sediments are now void of water or only partially filled with water, and you get a volume decrease and settlement of that liquefied layer. So this San Francisco 1906 earthquake was a famous one, of course, and one that spurred much of the research into why earthquakes happen and what causes them. It was a major impetus in the development of earthquake science and seismology. Here we see a street in 1906 that suffered a lot of damage in the 1906 earthquake, and this street happened to be on top of made ground or artificial fill, which had not been densified appropriately or engineered or compacted, so that it got shaken up quite a bit during the occurrence of the earthquake and caused loss of support for the street and the structures above. This is more recent, of course, 1989, the so-called World Series earthquake. This is a similar situation where this building was sitting on top of artificial fill, and the earthquake shook up that loose, not densified material and caused structural vulnerabilities, loss of support, and collapse of the structure. Now, I mentioned that liquefiable sediments can sometimes get shaken up so much they eject along pre-existing fractures and come to near the surface, ground surface, and this can cause what we call sand boils or mud volcanoes, where the sediment actually shoots up out of the ground and the fine sand then is deposited on top of ground surface, and this is due to earthquake shaking. This is my friend looking at a sand boil that was caused by the large Easter Sunday earthquake in 2010 that occurred in Southern California and northern Mexico. So what do we do with some of this information that as engineering geologists we derive by studying the location of faults and transmit some of this data to engineers and land planners? Well, this is a section of a land planning map that was developed by the city of San Diego. The different colors represent different types of geologic hazard zones, if you will. The orange areas, for example, are areas that are prone to landslides. The pink areas are areas that are prone to geologic hazard from the location or existence of earthquake faults. So each of these red lines, for example, are mapped earthquake faults. Where you see the slanted cross-hatching, that's an area within which has been zoned by the state of California. So if you wanted to build anything within these zones, you would have to hire a geologist, engineering geologist, to go and prove that there are no faults underneath your property. So this is a known active fault, the Rose Canyon fault zone area. So the state designated areas on either side of this fault within a quarter mile of the actual fault trace to say, okay, if you're going to build here, be careful. You can build here if you dig on your property, put in a trench, hire an engineering geologist and geotechnical engineers to see if there's any faults underneath your property. If there are, and if they're active, then you may not be able to dig to build there, or you may have to have a construction setback, which means you can't build within 25, 50 feet from the actual fault trace that you found. So again, this is a land use map, various designations. These are generally stable areas. These are fault prone areas. These are landslide areas. It's pretty well known that when you have major faults, major active faults, that because of the nature of faulting through time, any movement along major faults tends to fracture and shear rocks as these faults move, so that if you're in a hilly area, the sheared and fractured rocks can become unstable and lead to the occurrence of landslides. So that's something else that an engineering geologist has to be aware of and has to assess and transmit information to his or her client. Now here's a general cartoon of what you might be able to do to help your house withstand earthquake shaking. This goes into the realm of engineering geology, seismicity, and construction. So look at the chimney here. You might want to brace or replace your masonry chimney. You might want to reinforce it. Inside the house, if you have a ceiling fan over your bed, you might want to make sure that it's secure and it's not going to fall on you when you're sleeping during an earthquake. Other examples, strap down your televisions so they don't fall over. This is important. Know how and where and when to shut off your utilities, especially gas and electricity. A ruptured gas line broken by earthquake is a very hazardous situation. Okay. So I talked about setbacks just a minute ago. So here's an example of an actual project where somebody wanted to build something and engineering geologists, including myself, found a fault going through the site. This is the general trace of the fault. On either side of this fault, which was an active fault, because we had evidence of it cutting young sediments, either side of this fault we have a setback zone. So that means this gray area here. I think 25 feet on this side, 25 feet on that side. So that means you cannot build anything within this construction setback zone because it's sort of a hazard zone that's been set aside due to the possibility of fault rupture, which means if an active fault moves, it will rupture the ground. If you have a structure sitting on top of it, it will rupture that structure. So you stay out of there. And you can build over here, and you can build over here. Another way to get a lot of good information data on is to look at excavations that are exposed. So this is downtown San Diego, and I was involved in a number of projects for high rises in downtown San Diego, where because of parking limitations on the streets, many of these high rises had basement, sub-basement excavations for parking garages. And it was our mission, as stipulated by the city and the state, to look for earthquake faults within an area that's designated earthquake or hazardous from earthquakes because of the proximity of earthquake faults. Much of downtown San Diego is stipulated that way, where if you have a project proposed for this area, then you have to go in and map and log exposures and look for any earthquake faults. So what a geologist does is actually look at these available exposures as the crews are cutting down into the subsurface. And these are really good opportunities to get a lot of geologic information. You have excellent horizontal and vertical control because all these beams that you see here are mapped on plans that you can then use to precisely locate any features within a foot or so. So these are very good ways of getting some or providing some well-defined geologic data. Okay, another large issue that engineering geologists are involved with in projects, especially in hillsides, are landslides. There are many types of landslides. Some landslides go slowly, some landslides go rapidly, but they can be dangerous to construction to projects to life and limb that can cause injury and they can cause death. Billions of dollars every year are spent mitigating or are lost because of the loss of life and injury because of this hazard. Okay, so you don't want your hillside to be slip sliding away, obviously. There are different types of mass movement or slope failure. These are rotational landslides where you have a well-defined curved surface. So the slide slips downwards and then kind of rotates. And you can find these in deep clay-rich hillsides. Or you can find them also where there's a well-defined weak plane running through the base of the slope failure. Translational landslides are fairly straight and uniform. Block slides involve rock primarily, as does rock fall, especially in rock masses that are pervasively fractured. The rock itself could be maybe very strong and dense, but if it's fractured, then the failures will occur along the planes of fracture, whether they're vertical, horizontal, or subhorizontal. You have another variation of slope failure where fractured or vertically fractured rock masses can topple over. Debris flows are especially dangerous in Southern California and Northern California, where there's a confluence of heavy rainfall, debris and mud and trees, etc., that have collected in the heads of valleys. The rain soaks all this material and the mass can let go and sometimes can run rather rapidly down these canyons and take out structures and take away lives or injure people. Debris avalanche is similar, and earth flow is more or less a more slowly moving slope failure, and you have a depression or subsidence near the top, making what we call a scarp or a cliff, as you see here. And then the rest of the mass, as you go down slope, will get wetter and more saturated. Creep is a very common slope failure mode that takes place slowly, but whenever you see a hillside, there's typically some creep going on. It's not especially hazardous and dangerous because it's very slow, but it can, over time, can compromise structures, can knock over walls, it can displace roads, and so forth. Lateral spread is not real common in where I am in Southern California. You have to have a very saturated clay-rich layer that, or a liquefaction situation and a free phase. The earthquake shaking comes along, shakes things up, and material tends to move along a pre-existing plane. This can occur in glacial sediments, in wet or heavy rainfall areas, for example. So here's a case study of a landslide in coastal California, Southern California, or Central. La Conchita in 2005, this came down and, as you can see, overflowed a number of homes, took a few lives. This hillside is composed of sheared and weak rock. There is a orchard up here which tends to get irrigated. So all this water coming into this weak sheared material caused slope failures, and which took the form of debris avalanche, debris torrent, fairly rapid movement. So those slope failures are situations that have to be addressed through geotechnical engineering, engineering geology. I'll elaborate on those as we go on to future PowerPoint presentations. Finally, water underground, or groundwater. Now, groundwater a lot of people think of as rivers flowing underground. In one major case that happens, in cavern systems, you can have actual rivers flowing through cavernous cavities that have been formed by dissolution of limestone. But most groundwater is held within pores between grains of soil or between grains within rock masses or within fractures within rock masses. So it's an undesirable condition when you have underground water that's too close to the surface and you want to build. So here's a picture of the general concept of groundwater. You have groundwater, again, held within fractures or within pores between grains of soil or rock. And where you do have the saturated condition, you call it saturated zone. The top of surface of this groundwater is called the water table or piezometric surface, Piezometric. I think I got that right. And where the groundwater or water table surface intersects a free face, like a stream channel, it will feed into a lake or a river. In fact, most rivers are not filled by rainwater, they're filled with groundwater. So here you have an undesirable construction condition where a building is being built and a foundation is being laid out and concrete's already in, but now you've got this water flooding this area. So this could have been prevented if there had been maybe more input from an engineering geologist who would have told the designer, hey, there's shallow groundwater here. And if you put your foundation at that elevation, you're going to get flooded. So obviously that advice, if it was indeed given, was not heeded. So all you can do at this point is drain the water out, pump it out, and keep it lowered down below the footings by perhaps some wells that are put around the structure where groundwater is being continuously pumped out. So obviously a not desirable situation. You don't want to have an expensive maintenance measure like that taking place over months or years. So shallow groundwater can affect our choice of building sites. I'm going to move on to the next PowerPoint, hopefully post it soon. Thank you for your attention.